Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in the United Kingdom, because currently things are not going well for the new government that took over in July 24, and there are now rumours circulating that the government is considering reversing Brexit and getting closer to the European Union again. Now, if you don't follow UK politics, the United Kingdom was previously a full member of the European Union between 1973 and the start of 2020, so for over 47 years. However, in 2016, the people of the UK were asked to vote on a simple question: do you want to remain in the European Union or leave? And after a lot of debate, the vote went in favour of leaving, 51.9%, versus the people who wanted to stay. And since that time, there has been a lot of debate about whether or not that was the right decision. But ultimately, in January 2020, the UK left the European Union. And it's been talked about ever since. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that I don't really like to talk about Brexit, because anybody that's from the UK is sick and tired of talking about it. It is a thing from the past. However, at the moment, there is a lot of discussion that the Labour government that took over in July is looking to reverse a lot of the policies. They're talking about allowing mobility for under 30s. They're talking about things like changing the deal that was struck in 2020 to get a better agreement for the United Kingdom. But of course, any changes to the deal will come at a cost. And there are now rumours that the European Union wants to start imposing laws again, that the UK may have to go to the EU to agree certain things, and also it may have to give up things like its fishing rights. But before we come on to talk about Brexit in more detail, let's have a look at what's going on in the UK economy. This chart shows the year-on-year movement in gross domestic product for the UK, which is reported on a quarterly basis, and this chart goes back to the end of 2021. And what you can see is that between the end of 2021 and the end of 2023, there was a gradual reduction in GDP growth. And in the third and fourth quarters of 2023, GDP actually started reducing, which meant that the UK was technically in recession at the end of last year. Now, that recession ended in the first quarter of 2024, when the UK bounced back with 0.7% growth in GDP. However, growth reduced to 0.4% in the second quarter of this year, and the most recently reported figures for the third quarter of 24 show that GDP has now flatlined. There was 0% growth. And if you look at the trend here, there are now concerns that the UK is going to start seeing falling GDP again and could go back into recession. And you can see the rising risk of recession from this chart, which shows the monthly movements in GDP. And this reveals that both in September and October, GDP fell by 0.1%. So that gives us a strong indication that the next quarterly figure could well be a reduction in GDP. And so everybody is now very worried that the UK is heading back into a negative growth scenario. So as we've seen from the GDP data, growth in the UK is now starting to slow down. And this raises the question as to whether or not this is the new government's fault, or if this is a legacy left over by the previous government. And obviously, Labour, who are now in power, are saying it's all the fault of the previous government, the Conservative government. However, the Conservatives are saying this is down to Labour's new policies. And in terms of those policies, the one thing that Labour has done so far is announce the budget at the end of October. And Rachel Reeves, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, so basically sets all of the economic policies, came out and said that the previous government had left a £22 billion black hole in the economy, and that needed to be fixed as part of the budget. And she announced a variety of tax increases in the October budget, which amounted to around 1.2% of UK GDP, which was actually the second largest tax-raising budget in UK history, and equated to around £40 billion of increased taxes. This chart shows the movement in UK retail sales, which gives us a really strong indication as to what consumers are doing in the UK. It tells us whether or not they're confident and are spending more, or if people are becoming more nervous. And what this shows is that in the first 6 months of 2024, there was a lot of nervousness amongst UK consumers, with retail sales falling in February, April and June. However, the level of confidence changed following the change of government in July, and we saw retail sales rise by 1.1% in July, 1.9% in August, and 3.2% in September. However, as the Labour government budget started to approach in October, people became less confident, and retail sales only grew by 2% in October, and the figures for November show that retail sales were only up by 0.5%. And if you look at the trend for the last 2 months, you can see that there's been a reducing increase in retail sales, which tells us that UK consumers are now more nervous and less confident. This chart shows the level of confidence amongst UK businesses and looks at things like the new orders that those businesses are receiving and what's happening with their costs and sales prices. And the scale on the right hand side of this chart is an index and goes from -50 at the bottom to +15 at the top. And the zero line at the top of this chart shows the neutral position, so neither confident nor pessimistic. And the bars you can see here represent the quarterly figures dating back to the start of 2022. The blue section at the top means that UK businesses overall are confident of growth, and the yellow section at the bottom tells us that they are not confident. So the initial takeaway here is that over the last 3 years there has been a general lack of confidence amongst UK businesses. But if we focus in on what's been happening in 2024, you can see that in the first quarter there was a small element of pessimism. However, the trend was improving from the last quarter of 2023. In the second quarter of 2024, the score was actually 9 points positive. So that meant that overall, UK businesses were positive about the outlook for the rest of this year. However, that changed in the third quarter when the score fell to -9 points. And the most recent score for the fourth quarter of 2024 is -24 points, which is actually the worst score that's been recorded since the final quarter of 2022. And let's remember that the UK went into recession technically during 2023. So this chart really tells us that UK businesses are very nervous about what's happening in the UK economy right now. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation for the UK over the past 12 months. And just before we get into the details, I'll remind you that the UK's target rate of inflation is 2%. That's what the government would like to be achieving. And what this chart shows is that in the first 6 months of 2024, the government did exactly what it wanted to. It brought down inflation from 4%, which is where it was sitting at the start of the year, to the target level of 2% in May and June. Now, in July and August, it bounced back up to 2.2%, which is not a disaster. It's still in the right ballpark. It then fell to 1.7% in September. But interestingly, in October and November, we have seen continued rises in inflation. And the latest figures for November show that inflation is now sitting at 2.6%, which is 0.6% higher than where the Bank of England would like it to be. And if you look at the trend, that is now causing concern that prices are going to start rising again. And of course, the reason why inflation is so important is because it's directly linked to what's happening with interest rates. And as you can see from this chart, between the end of 2021 and August 2023, the UK rapidly increased interest rates from 0.1% to 5.25%. Now, consumers in the UK have been hoping for interest rate cuts as they've seen inflation coming down, and there have been 2 cuts in 2024 to the current level of 4.75%. However, the recent increases in inflation has meant that the Bank of England has held off with any further cuts, and the current interest rate of 4.75% is seen as worryingly high for consumers and businesses in the UK. They want that rate to come down before they'll start borrowing significant amounts again, and there is a real risk that if it stays at the current level, that it's going to slow down the UK economy and potentially push it back into recession. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, there are now rumours that the UK government is considering reversing Brexit and getting closer to the European Union again. And in a recent report published by the British Chamber of Commerce, there were 5 recommendations that are apparently put forward by British businesses in terms of improving the relationship with the EU. The 5 proposals are to eliminate or reduce the complexity of exporting food for small and medium-sized enterprises, creating a youth mobility programme covering school visits and exchanges and a time-limited ability for young people to travel for work, new arrangements to raise awareness for forthcoming regulatory changes, securing a supplementary deal like Norway's so smaller businesses don't need a representative in the EU for VAT purposes, and permission for UK firm staff to travel for longer and work in Europe and vice versa, and to provide mutual recognition of qualifications. And it's been reported that Keir Starmer has now set up a task force of around 100 people who've been given the task of sorting out a new deal with the European Union. Now, no details of that have been released as yet, but there is a lot of speculation that this could be the first step in terms of unpicking the Brexit deal and for the European Union and the UK becoming closer once more. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening in the UK economy right now is really quite fascinating, and also is important because the UK is the 6th largest economy in the world. So what happens in the UK will have a meaningful impact on the global economy. If the UK goes into recession and shrinks, then that will impact on business relationships with other countries. So it's not operating in isolation. Like I've said on many times on many other videos, the whole world is interrelated. And what we've seen from today's data is that following the initial takeover by Labour, there was a surge in confidence in the UK. People started to become more confident that things were going to change. However, following the Labour budget at the end of October, we saw a big increase in taxes, which is hurting a lot of UK businesses, and confidence is now starting to evaporate. And what we've seen in terms of the GDP figure is that the latest quarter, the UK has flatlined. There has been 0% growth. And when you look at the trend as to what's happening month by month, there is a strong indication that the next quarterly figures could show a fall in GDP and that the UK could end up back in recession at some point within the next 6 months. And this is obviously really bad news for the UK and also for the new government, because there is only a limited amount of time that you can blame the previous regime. Labour said that there was a £22 billion black hole in the economy when they took over. However, the budget that they posted in October is set to raise over $40 billion. So that should cover off that black hole and reset things. And what we're seeing at the moment is Labour is starting to become a bit worried about what's happening. And there's a real potential that we could see the Brexit deal that was finally put in place at the beginning of 2020, so almost 5 years ago now, it could be changed because Labour doesn't think that that deal was the right deal for the United Kingdom going forward. So it wants to renegotiate some of the terms. But of course, that will come at a cost. The European Union is not going to give the UK better terms without having some form of trade-off. And that could come in the form of either jurisdiction. The European Union may decide that it wants to have control over some of the UK's policies, or it could come in the form of things like fishing rights or additional trade deals or things that are going to benefit the EU in the long term. So the overall summary of today's video is that what we've seen in today's data tells us that the UK economy currently isn't doing particularly well. The trend is that GDP is falling, inflation is now rising again. That means that interest rates probably won't come down in the near future. That's going to hold back growth for both businesses and consumers. And overall, the picture right now for the start of 2025 for the UK is pessimistic, and it could go into recession in the first half of that year. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.